There is a population living deep in the rainforest of South America whose DNA looks less mixed than almost any other African-descended people on Earth. Not in West Africa itself. Not in any village along the old slave coast. In the interior of Suriname and French Guiana, surrounded on every side by indigenous Amazonian nations for 3 centuries, sharing rivers, marriages, wars, and treaties with them. And yet, when geneticists finally sequenced their genomes, the result did not show a blended population. It showed something closer to a sealed vault. To understand why that is strange, you have to understand who these people are. Starting in the late 17th century, enslaved Africans on Dutch plantations along the coast of Suriname began escaping in large numbers, fleeing into the dense interior rainforest where the colonial government had almost no reach. They did not scatter as individuals. They organized. Over the following decades, escaped communities consolidated into distinct nations with their own languages, their own leadership structures, and their own territories along the rivers of the interior, the Saramacca, the Ndiuka, the Aluku, the Paramacca, the Matawai, the Quinti. Collectively, history remembers them as the Maroons, and in Suriname and French Guiana today they are called the Noir Maroon. The Dutch tried for generations to destroy them. Military expeditions were sent into the interior repeatedly, and repeatedly they failed, defeated by disease, terrain, and the guerrilla tactics of people who knew the forest far better than any European soldier ever could. By the 1760s, the colonial government admitted defeat in the only way that mattered. It signed peace treaties, recognizing Maroon sovereignty over their own territories, a stunning outcome for enslaved people who had simply walked into the jungle and refused to walk back out. Here is where the standard historical account usually settles into something comfortable and expected. Living deep in the Amazonian interior for 3 centuries, the Maroons necessarily built close relationships with the indigenous nations who were already there, the Kalina, the Wayana, the Trio, among others. Oral history and colonial records both describe intermarriage, shared river settlements, trade in goods and knowledge, and in some documented cases, formal alliances forged during the wars against the Dutch. Anthropologists have long noted how thoroughly Maroon material culture reflects this contact. Dugout canoe construction techniques, forest navigation knowledge, hunting and fishing practices, and elements of spiritual cosmology all show what looks unmistakably like indigenous Amazonian influence, absorbed and adapted over generations. Given all of that, here is the question that should have a straightforward answer. If 2 peoples lived interwoven for 300 years, sharing rivers, marriages, warfare, and survival itself, how much of that intimacy shows up in the genome? Every reasonable assumption pointed toward a population with substantial mixed ancestry, something in the range documented among other diaspora populations shaped by long contact with indigenous communities, comparable to what researchers have found among the Garifuna of Central America, where indigenous ancestry runs as high as 40% in some communities. That assumption is exactly what population genetics went on to demolish. The first major clues came from immunoglobulin marker studies in the early 2000s, followed by a landmark genome-wide analysis published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2017, led by researchers including César Forte Lima and Alain Guessin, sequencing more than 4 million genetic markers across Maroon communities in French Guiana and Suriname. What the data showed was not a blended population. It showed a population with a sub-Saharan African genetic contribution higher than that of almost any other African-descended group ever studied, figures in the range of 95 to 98%. European ancestry measured at only about 2.5%. Indigenous American ancestry lower still, roughly 1.5 to 2%. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is the twist, and it inverts everything the cultural evidence seemed to promise. 3 centuries of shared rivers, documented intermarriage, military alliances forged in blood against a common colonial enemy, canoe-building techniques and forest knowledge that anthropologists can trace directly to indigenous Amazonian sources. And underneath all of that cultural exchange, a genome that is almost entirely, overwhelmingly African, more so, in fact, than the DNA of most African American, Afro-Brazilian, or, Afro-Caribbean populations shaped by plantation-era mixing back on the coast. How does a population absorb an enormous amount of a neighboring culture's practical knowledge while absorbing almost none of that neighbor's DNA? The answer researchers have converged on involves a phenomenon population geneticists call cultural transmission without proportional genetic admixture, and it points to something specific about how Maroon society organized itself from its very founding. Escaped communities in the interior grew not primarily through continued intermarriage with outside groups, but through their own internal reproduction, reinforced by continual new arrivals of formerly enslaved Africans, escaping the coastal plantations well into the 18th century. By the time the major treaties were signed, demographic reconstruction suggests that well over 99% of the Saramacca population had already been born within Maroon territory itself, not brought in from outside. The population, in other words, became self-sustaining and genetically closed remarkably fast, even as it remained culturally porous, borrowing constantly and openly from the indigenous nations around it. There is also a harder, more structural explanation running underneath the demographic one, and it has to do with how alliances between Maroons and indigenous nations actually functioned. Where treaties and trade relationships existed, they appear to have operated more as political and economic arrangements between distinct, self-governing peoples than as pathways to large-scale intermarriage. Some Maroon oral traditions describe formal marriage exchanges as rare, deliberate, almost diplomatic acts rather than the routine, generation-over-generation blending seen in other colonial contact zones. Culture crossed the boundary constantly. Genes, for reasons still not fully understood, crossed it only in a trickle. This is where the Maroon case becomes genuinely useful for thinking about identity more broadly, because it forces a distinction that gets collapsed far too often. The difference between what a people learned and what a people inherited biologically. A Saramacca canoe builder today works with techniques that trace back to indigenous Amazonian craft. A Saramacca spiritual practitioner draws on cosmological concepts that show clear signs of indigenous influence layered onto African religious frameworks. None of that cultural inheritance required a large biological one to travel alongside it. Knowledge moved through trade, observation, alliance, and necessity. Genes moved through reproduction, and reproduction, it turns out, largely stayed within the boundaries of the Maroon nations themselves. The rice tells a related and equally striking story. Enslaved West Africans who escaped onto Suriname's rivers carried with them, whether in seed pouches or simply in memory, knowledge of rice cultivation practiced for generations across West Africa's rice-growing regions. Genomic analysis of rice varieties still grown today in Saramacca and Nduka communities shows a direct, traceable line back to African rice cultivars, distinct from the commercial Asian rice varieties introduced later by colonial agriculture. 350 years after the first escapes into the interior, Maroon farmers are still cultivating descendants of the same rice lineages their ancestors carried out of bondage, a botanical echo of the same African specificity now showing up independently in the human genome. What this means for the roughly 100,000 Noir Maroon people living today along the Moroni and Suriname rivers, and for their diaspora communities in the Netherlands and beyond, is a genetic record that confirms something their own oral tradition already insisted on: an African identity preserved with unusual completeness, not despite 3 centuries in the Americas, but in some ways because of the specific way those centuries unfolded. Where other diaspora populations were pulled apart, resold, and dispersed across plantations that deliberately mixed ethnic groups to prevent solidarity, the Maroons removed themselves from that system entirely and rebuilt something closer to a closed, self-replicating African society, hidden in a rainforest that the colonial world could never fully penetrate. There is also a comparative point worth sitting with because it sharpens exactly how unusual the Maroon case is. Among other African-descended populations in the Americas, shaped by centuries of contact with indigenous nations, the pattern runs the opposite direction. The Garifuna of the Caribbean and Central America, born from a shipwreck and absorption into island Carib communities, carry indigenous ancestry approaching 40% in some populations, a signature of centuries of continued intermarriage after their founding moment. Afro-descendant populations along parts of the Colombian and Brazilian coasts show measurable indigenous contributions as well, reflecting generations of contact in regions where plantation, slavery, and indigenous displacement occurred side by side. Against that backdrop, the Maroon genome stands out precisely because it is the exception. Every other comparable population tested shows some meaningful genetic trace of the indigenous nations they lived alongside. The Noir Maroon, despite 3 centuries of documented alliance, marriage, and cultural exchange with Amazonian peoples, show almost none. Researchers studying this pattern have suggested that the scale and self-sufficiency of Maroon population growth, combined with the specific, limited nature of intermarriage arrangements described in oral tradition, may be unique enough in the Americas that no other population offers a clean parallel. This also reframes how historians read the peace treaties themselves. For generations, those agreements were understood primarily as military and political documents, formal recognition that the Dutch colonial government could not defeat the Maroon nations by force. The genetic record adds a second, quieter layer to that reading. The treaties were negotiated between two populations who, whatever alliances and marriages individual families formed, remained genetically distinct and demographically self-contained societies. The peace of the 1760s was not simply the peace between a colonial power and a subject people. It was, in an unplanned and unrecorded way, also the boundary line between two genetically separate nations who had chosen, generation after generation, to remain exactly that. There is a political dimension to this that extends well past ancestry curiosity. Suriname's government has, in recent years, included a vice president of Nduka Maroon descent, a fact that would have been unthinkable to the Dutch colonial administrators who spent a century failing to defeat these communities militarily. Land rights disputes in the interior, disputes over logging concessions, gold mining, and river access, continue to test whether the sovereignty the Maroons won through treaty in the 1760s still means anything in a modern extractive economy. Genetic research does not settle those disputes. But a population whose DNA confirms an unbroken, overwhelmingly African lineage, stretching back to the first generation of escapees, carries a different kind of claim to the land than a population assumed incorrectly to have been substantially absorbed into surrounding indigenous or colonial populations over time. Stand today on the banks of the Suriname River, near a Saramacca village, and you are looking at a place where two different kinds of inheritance moved at two entirely different speeds. The canoe pulled up on the riverbank carries forward indigenous engineering knowledge passed down through generations of contact. The person paddling it carries forward a genome that, in its overwhelming majority, never left Africa in any meaningful genetic sense at all, even after 400 years and 8,000 kilometers. The rainforest did not dilute this population. In a strange and unplanned way, it sealed it. The larger lesson sitting inside this data is one that should unsettle any simple model of what happens when two peoples share territory for centuries. Proximity does not guarantee genetic mixing. Alliance does not guarantee intermarriage. Deep cultural borrowing can run in one direction while biological inheritance stays remarkably contained in another. The Maroons of Suriname and French Guiana did not simply survive in the Amazon. They built something closer to an ark, absorbing what the forest could teach them about how to live in it, while keeping the core of who they were, encoded quietly in every generation's DNA, essentially untouched. 3 centuries of history assumed that closeness meant merging. The genome says otherwise, and it has been saying so patiently, waiting 300 years for someone to finally sequence it and listen.